Happy Sunday, everybody. How are you doing on this glorious Sunday morning as we get ready for our Thanksgiving break? We're going to go in and get into our lesson. And before we do that, let's have a little praise and worship. Hope you guys enjoyed that nice, lovely song during our praise and worship. This morning, our lesson, we're going to be talking about thanking God all day long. Why not? You should be thanking Him all day long, right? So, and our lesson is going to come from Nehemiah 12. But before we talk about the lesson itself, let's give you a recap on what's been going on up until that point. So what is happening is that the Israelites, they were proud and they were stubborn and refused to listen to God. And over again, they would get their attention from God. And then once God allowed them to get what they want, once He gave them what they needed, they would go back to doing the same thing that they were doing in the beginning. So what God decided to do was God decided to call on their enemies to cause them to suffer. And then they would cry out to God and He would make things better for them. And as soon as everything was better, the Israelites went back to doing the same thing they were doing. For example, you know how you want a certain toy for Christmas. And mom says to you, well, if you want it, you have to do X, Y, and Z, or you have to clean your room. Well, you clean your room. Christmas comes, you get that gift because mom told you to do a certain thing and you did it. After Christmas goes, You back to doing the same thing. Mom has to constantly tell you, clean your room, clean your room, clean your room. What do you do? In a minute. I don't want to. Or my favorite. Can you help me? It's too much. I can't do it. I'm too little. You know that one. I hear that. I've heard that one a lot. So, but that was what the Israelites were doing to God. They would constantly make mistakes, ask God for help. He would basically bail them out. And then he decided that after being patient for a very long time, he decided to allow their enemies to come and capture the Israelites and take them away from the promised land and into the enemy's countries. Then 70 years go by. God allowed some of the Israelites to return to their land and begin rebuilding their temple. Nehemiah was living in a foreign country when he found out that some of God's people were back in the promised land and that they were rebuilding God's temple in the city of Jerusalem. He also heard that there was no wall to protect the city and to protect the people rebuilding the temple. Nehemiah told God that he was willing to go back and help. God answered Nehemiah's prayer by softening the heart of the Persian king, and the king not only gave permission for Nehemiah to go, he also gave him the supplies to use for rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. Despite many trials, Nehemiah encouraged the people to persevere and to continue trusting God for his help. Eventually, the walls were restored and more Israelites began to move back to Jerusalem. Now, where our story begins, we'll start from there in Nehemiah chapter 12. And we got to do verses 27 to 43. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites out of all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to keep their dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and with singing and with cymbals and with harps. And the sons of the singers gathered themselves together, both out of the plain country around Jerusalem and from the villages. Also from the house of Gilgal and out of the fields of Geba, for the singers had built them villages round about Jerusalem. Verse 31. Then I brought up the princes of Judah upon the wall, and appointed 2 great companies of them that gave thanks, whereof one of them went right hand upon the wall toward the dung gate. And what he had was, he had like band players, I would say. So a group of people that played a lot of different instruments. So they started playing instruments. They started making music. We're going to jump down to verse 40. So stood the 2 companies of them that gave thanks in the house of God, and I, and half of the rulers with me, and the priests, all stood and sang and made sacrifices and great offerings, and they all rejoiced. For God had made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is a short video about being thankful.
God's story, Nehemiah. So part of God's story is about a guy named Nehemiah, and it goes like this. Remember God's family? They were called the Israelites because they lived in, you guessed it, Israel. But some of them lived far away from their home, and one of those guys was Nehemiah. He lived in Persia and worked for the king. One day, his brother told him that a city in Israel called Jerusalem was suffering, and many people there weren't following God anymore, and their city wasn't in very good shape. Nehemiah cried, "God, you are wonderful, but your family's home is in trouble. Please help us. When I serve the king his wine today, make him pleased with me and have him do what I ask." Later, when Nehemiah served the king's wine, the king noticed that Nehemiah looked sad. So the king asked why. Nehemiah told him about Jerusalem and asked if he could go back to rebuild the wall. The king could have killed Nehemiah for asking to leave, but instead, he said go. He even helped. That's because God heard Nehemiah's prayer and answered it. Anyway, Nehemiah went to work rebuilding the wall, but little did he know he was going to need to ask for a lot more help from God. See, God and his family have always had enemies, and these enemies wanted to stop Nehemiah and the people helping him. First, they made fun of them. So Nehemiah prayed again. He said, God, some people hate us. Please get rid of them, and went back to work. Now, God does hear and answer every prayer, but sometimes not in the way we expect or even in the way we want. And at first, it seemed like God wasn't answering this one at all, because when the enemy saw that Nehemiah was still building, they planned an attack. But Nehemiah trusted that God heard his prayer even if it didn't feel like it. And God did! He caused some people to overhear the enemy's plan and warn Nehemiah. Even though the enemies were still after him, Nehemiah planned a defense and told the others, "Don't be afraid of your enemies. Remember the Lord. He is great and powerful." And on they worked, building, building, building. The closer the wall got to being finished, the more Nehemiah's enemies realized they couldn't stop him by making fun of him or by attacking him. Time for something else. They tried everything. They sent messages to get Nehemiah to leave the wall and meet them. He wouldn't. They hoped Nehemiah's hands would get weak, but Nehemiah had asked God to make his hands stronger. They even paid a priest to ask Nehemiah to leave the wall and come to the temple. But Nehemiah trusted God more than anyone else, even the priest, and he refused to stop doing the job God had given him. Kids, are you willing to listen to God and obey him, no matter what? Well, finally, the wall was done. God's family got to go home again, and Nehemiah's enemies found that nothing stops God's plans. The Israelites celebrated and praised God, and as they praised, they realized how much their sins had hurt God, and they felt terrible. They told God they were sorry and thanked him for helping them. Then they made a brand new promise to follow him, and Jerusalem was once again a safe place where people honored God. And that's the story of Nehemiah. But just so you know, there's another story where God fixes something that's broken. See, one day, God would send a very special rescuer, not to save a wall, but to save the world. He made it possible for not just Israelites, but everyone in the whole world to confess their sin to God, thank him for his rescue, and follow him. And just like that old wall was made new back then, our old lives can be made new right now, because Jesus has rescued us. And that's a part of God's story.
All right, and I have a relevant scripture for you all as well. It comes from Psalms 100, verses 1 through 3. And it goes, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture.